This happened a few years ago, in the autumn, on a night that I would personally call pretty typical. It was pretty deep autumn. All the trees had shifted to their pretty colors, and it was starting to get cold. We hadn't gotten snow yet, but we'd gone through a few bouts of pretty heavy rain here and there over the previous month. I was a senior in high school at the time, 17 for a few more months. I lived with my mom in my childhood home still, and it was just the two of us, as my dad was KIA overseas when I was a little girl. I remember that night was a pretty creepy and dark one, and we were getting hit with those storms that I previously mentioned. It was raining like crazy. I had decided to go ahead and stay home instead of going out with my boyfriend because of how bad it was out. Plus, I was exhausted after all my schoolwork, volleyball practice, and then having to study for midterms. By the time I got home, I was looking forward to a quiet evening just doing whatever I wanted at home. My mom was a nurse at a local hospital, and she had to work the night shift, so I had the whole house to myself. I made myself something to eat and watched a couple episodes of something on Netflix before I decided that I would just go to bed early. By early in this situation, I mean around 8. It was still downpouring when I went up to brush my teeth. By the time I crawled into bed, it had turned from just rain to some pretty heavy winds and a lot of lightning. I remember thinking that I was going to wake up to the tornado sirens. That's how bad the storm was getting. I plugged my phone in to make sure that I had a charge in case the power went out, and I laid there with the TV on the news, but down low enough that I could barely hear it. I put my head down on my pillow and stared at the ceiling. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remembered was being jolted awake by what sounded like a loud bang. Disoriented, I looked at my clock and it was a bit past 10 p.m. The storm was still going, though it had definitely slowed some. I paused for a second thinking that the bang was probably just thunder from a close-by lightning strike, but then I heard it again. A distinct, sharp bang coming from downstairs. My heart started racing. I wasn't sure if this was someone banging on the door to get my attention, or if it was someone hitting the door to break it down. I wasn't fully awake nor 100% sure what to do, so I exited my room and walked out into the hallway to see if I could figure out which it was. As soon as I opened my door and stepped out, I heard one more loud bang and the sound of wood splintering. It was pretty obvious at this point which one it was. Unfortunately, I was upstairs, and there were no exits up there. If I went downstairs, I would pass by the front door no matter which direction I tried to go, meaning that I would pass by whoever it was that had just kicked the door in. I ultimately decided to run back into my bedroom, lock the door, and call 911 with my cell phone, which thankfully I had on my end table. I ran back down the hallway into my room, locked it up, and grabbed my phone, dialing 911 as I crawled under my bed, just trying to hide in any way that I could. The silence of the room as I laid there breathing heavily and waiting for the call to connect was insufferable. I didn't know if the person that had kicked the door in was now in the house, or where in the house they were. The 911 operator finally answered, and I explained what had happened in a hushed but terrified tone. I told her my address and said that I was upstairs and that someone had kicked in the front door. She told me that the police were on the way, and asked me for a bit more information. Specifically, if I had seen the person at all, or if I knew they were in the house. I told her that I didn't know, and that I had not seen him, because I had just heard the sound of the door being kicked in and then hid. She told me to stay where I was, and to stay as quiet as I could, and did everything to keep me calm and keep me informed on how close the police were. I just stayed right where I was, trying to keep my breathing stable, but struggling to really pull in any air. It was dark, quiet, and the only sound that I could hear outside of my phone was the rain as it smacked my window. After about 5 minutes, the dispatcher told me that the officers were in the driveway, but to stay where I was until they called out to me to come out. I told her that I would, and she waited on the line with me until that happened. When the officers called out, I told her that they were there and thanked her before disconnecting. I walked out of my room and went down the stairs to meet the officers. As they stood in the doorway and were looking around at the damage to the door, the deadbolt was completely splintered and destroyed. There was wood on the floor, and I could see muddy shoe prints on the front of the door as it sort of just swung there, seeming to be barely attached. The officer took some information from me and said that they had looked around the yard already but didn't see anybody. They then came in to clear the other rooms and make sure that this guy wasn't hiding somewhere, but there was nobody else there. Based on the amount of mud on the front door, I think we would have been able to figure out if he'd walked in. So, based on that, it looked like they had just kicked in the door and walked away. I honestly have no idea why someone would do that. Why someone would kick in the door to a house and then not enter said house. Was this just to scare anyone that was there, or was it some kind of messed up prank? I'm honestly asking, as I have no idea. I had to call my mom and tell her about what happened, and the officers stayed for the extra 20 or so minutes while my mom got home. I explained the whole thing to her, and the officer gave her information for a case number, but basically said that there was not a high chance of us finding who did this, because it kind of looked like a random act of vandalism at this point. My mom had to get into contact with someone to come out the next day to repair the door, which was an expensive hassle, but thankfully it was able to get done quickly. One more thing to note about the situation. The next day, the neighbor on the side of the street actually came over and mentioned that his Ring camera had picked up what happened, and he didn't notice it until that afternoon. He showed us the video, and you could see this man in a black hoodie and black pants walk down the street until he got in front of our house. He just stopped there in front of it, seemed to stand there for a couple of moments before walking through our yard, stepping up on the porch, and literally giving the door 3 solid kicks until it gave way. He leaned into the house, like just his head, and seemed to glance around for half a second, before turning around and walking back down the sidewalk, and continuing down the street like nothing had happened. We couldn't see his face because of how dark it was, but we had video of what had happened, and obviously gave it to the police for all the good that it would do. It was just crazy to watch this play out. It was so random. It was as if this guy just was looking for a random door to kick. Like he didn't want to break in, he just wanted to let some frustration out. And I guess our door looked perfect for it. That night gave me some anxiety, and I didn't really like being home alone anymore, thinking it could happen again or that he would come back. My mom actually had a security camera installed on our front porch as well. I think that she was as freaked out as I was. It never did happen again, and it's been about 3 or 4 years since this took place, so I guess it was just a one-off random act of destruction. One that terrified me and left me thinking that something terrible was going to happen. I've always found walking at night to be relaxing, and when I adopted my dog, Mari, I gave myself more reason to get out and take a long walk every night. Mari was a large and very friendly German Shepherd mix. Mix with what, I don't remember, but he was mostly shepherd, and he was the sweetest dog that I've ever had the pleasure of knowing. There was one night in the fall when we'd gone walking down one of our normal trails, where things went a bit sour. But thankfully we got out mostly unscathed. All thanks to Maury. It was a pretty typical fall night. Mostly overcast, a bit chilly, and the wind was pretty strong, which told me that we were probably going to get some rain. But I figured that we could get out and get a walk in before it hit. It had been a pretty crappy day at work, so when I got home, I ate my dinner quickly, grabbed Maury's leash, and headed out. A little bit into the walk, it started to rain softly, which was fine. We weren't going to be stopped by a little water from the sky. Our trail took us through a number of residential streets before it looped back through a small wooded park. When we got to the park area, the rain had started to pick up, which prompted me to grab my umbrella, which I was thankful that I brought along with us. But we were going to finish the path, because Maury was very much wanting to keep going. When we got to the wooded end of the park, Maury happily trotting along and giving his soft barks randomly, his way of telling me that he was happy and wanted to keep walking. In the middle of his happy stomps, he paused and lifted his head, perking his ears. I paused next to him and asked him what was up, assuming that he just saw an owl or a raccoon or something. He was staring very intently into the darkness beyond the path. I tried to follow his gaze, but whatever it was that he saw was invisible to me. I knelt down, gave him some pats, and pulled him a bit to get him to continue. He did, but he was slow as he pressed on. As we took a few steps forward, I couldn't seem to shake this growing anxiety that something was up. He was being too cautious for my liking, and I was starting to feel off. I thought maybe it was just a mix of the cold, the isolation of the trail, and the weather, but making up excuses for the off feeling wasn't doing it for me. Maury stopped again, this time perking his ears up, and the fur on his back was starting to fluff as well, which really made me feel a bit freaked out. He was normally a very calm boy, but the mood that he was displaying was one of caution and tense defensiveness. Around that time, I started to hear what sounded like footsteps mirroring our slow pace, but slightly off rhythm. I paused again, listening closely, but as I stopped, so did the other footsteps. I scanned the trees and bushes around us, but I couldn't see anything. And at this point, I was kicking myself for not bringing an actual flashlight. My iPhone wasn't cutting it. It lit the path well enough in front of us, but if you've ever used an older cell phone flashlight outside on a dark and rainy evening, you know that it's wholly ineffective. At this point, I was feeling very uneasy and was beginning to panic. My instincts were telling me that we were not in a safe position, so I figured we could make the quick trip off the path and cut the walk short. As we turned the corner, I started to hear the sound again, and I was certain that it was footsteps. This time they were quicker though, as if they were trying to catch up to us. I kept the leash tight and kept Maury as close to me as I could. He kept his body brushing against my leg the entire time, and was definitely ready to protect us if necessary. Something that I wanted to avoid if possible. I knew that he could tell I was freaking out by how he was holding himself. After another minute or two of walking, I knew that we were at an impasse, that I was going to have to confront this person that was clearly following us. I turned around quickly, and I shined the light as best as I could in the direction of where I thought the person was, and I loosened my grip on the leash slightly to let Maury step forward toward whoever it was. He wasn't going to be able to actually get to them unless they were within 6 feet of us, but he would be able to take a stance in front of me. As I turned my light, it highlighted the shape of a person behind me, wearing a dark hoodie. Mari saw him too and immediately launched into an aggressive tirade of growling and deep threatening barks. As soon as this happened, I watched as this person stopped, obviously surprised that I was confronting them. They immediately turned back the other way on the path and took off at top speed. My heart was pounding, mostly because I was right, that I was being followed. And worse yet, their reaction tells me that they probably had malicious intent. It could have been a normal person running away because a dog was barking at them, but I feel like a normal person that wasn't being a creep would have stopped and said something, not sprinted off into the rain. After this happened, I pulled on Mari and jogged the rest of the way off the path and back to my street. I was running on a lot of adrenaline and panic, so I made pretty good time. That night put me in a bit of a panic over walking that trail, and for a few nights after that we took the shorter path, one that was much better lit, and we avoided the park. This also triggered a bit of common sense in me, and after that night, I never went out without something to protect myself. I know that Mari would have protected me with his life, but I also didn't want him to have to. I did end up calling the police about this. I informed them that there was someone wearing dark clothing that had been following me on the trail through the park. I know that it wasn't much to report, but they said they would send some patrols through the area to see if they could find anyone. If them being around did anything to deter this person from doing this again, then I don't regret calling them. The incident did leave me a bit shaken, but mostly unwavering. And Mari and I kept up with our nightly walks until he couldn't really do it anymore. He did pass away in 2019, at the old age of 14 years old. But he was very well loved, and he was my protector up to the end. That said, I never forgot that feeling of that night. And every night we went for a walk on a longer path, especially on rainy evenings, I would get a bit of an uneasy feeling, thinking that something like that was going to happen again. I have a creepy and sad story that I'm going to try and not make too long, about something that happened to me that freaked me the hell out, and it happened last month. Where I live, October and November are when we get most of our rain for the second half of the year. We have pretty hot and dry summers, and then when fall and winter hits, we have mild temperatures and a lot of wet days. You can pretty much depend on October to be an umbrella month, and if you leave home without it, you'll be sorry. I recently moved into a new townhome on a small property on the edge of town. It's a nice little place, and I'm surrounded by a lot of retired people, so I love it, because they tend to not bother me. The townhome, while quaint, does have a bit of an eerie feeling to it, and I think the majority of that eeriness comes from the fact that they didn't install many lights. Most of the rooms do not have overhead lights, they just have an abundance of outlets for lamps. Unfortunately, I don't have very many lamps yet, so my place is pretty dark. When it gets dark outside, like during the stormy season, it is pretty creepy. Plus, the building is a bit older, so there's some give to the strong winds and a leak above the window in the living room. But that's an annoyance, not a creepy thing. I was in my living room listening to music and just doom-scrolling on my phone when I heard my doorbell ring. I was a bit confused as to why someone would be at my door, especially out in the rain like this, and at first I thought about just ignoring it, thinking they would go away. I'm not a very social person, to be completely honest with you. After the second doorbell ring, I got up and opened the door anyways, assuming it was one of my neighbors, and I really didn't want to be too much of an a-hole. I opened up to see an older lady that I knew as Betty standing there, drenched in the rain and just staring at me, with these empty eyes. It was a bit strange. We hadn't really spoken beyond passing hellos, and she looked like she was a bit out of it, like she was sleepwalking, almost. I asked what she was doing out in the rain in a joking way, but she just stared at me for a moment and honestly looked rather somber, like she was really upset. I leaned in a bit and I asked her if she was okay, if I could help her with anything. She very quietly said, "I need help." I told her okay, that I would help her, and then asked her what she needed help with. She turned and just pointed to the townhome that she lived in, keeping that same somber look and not speaking. After a second, I just nodded and said, "Okay, yeah, I can come over. Let me just get my shoes and my jacket, and we can go over there. Why don't you step inside and get out of the rain?" I said this and turned away from my door, walking into the hallway to grab my shoes and slipped them on. When I turned back to my door, she was gone. I was a bit confused. She was just there, and I hadn't taken more than 5 to 10 seconds to slip my shoes on. They were slip-on shoes. They didn't even have strings. I stepped back to the door to see if she'd started walking back towards her unit, but she wasn't outside at all. She was nowhere to be found. I stared off into the rain thinking, where the hell did she go? There was no way that she could have gotten to her unit and gotten inside in the time it took me to put on my shoes. She was rather elderly, and she was slow-moving and walked with a walker. It was then that I realized that I didn't see her walker when she was at my door. I knew that she needed it, so for her to not have it, and to be there, was a bit weird. I figured that maybe she'd somehow made it from my step back to her place while I was turned away. Maybe I had taken a bit longer to put my shoes on than I thought. I walked out into the rain and over to her unit and knocked on the door waiting for an answer. But she didn't. I rang the doorbell, still nothing. I was so confused, thinking I had just seen this little old lady at my front door. There was no way that she could have sprinted away from my door and gotten off the property in time that it took me to put my shoes on. I peered in her window to see if maybe I was just losing my mind, and when I did, I freaked out. I saw her. She was sitting in her chair in the living room, but she was slumped over, and she was pretty obviously gone. I could tell that she wasn't breathing, and that's when it hit me that what I saw at my door was not Betty. It was Betty's spirit. And that's why she was so quiet. That's why she didn't have her walker. And that's how she managed to disappear so quickly. And that's why she asked me for help, because she'd passed away, and she was worried that no one was going to notice. I don't know why she chose me, but she did. And I had to do what I could for her. I called 911 and explained to them that I'd had an elderly neighbor that I thought had passed away from what I could see in her window. It was a bit strange to explain, but I told them that, from where I was, it looked like she might be gone. They told me that they would send an ambulance to do a check, and when I hung up from that call, I called the emergency maintenance number for the property. I told the maintenance person that I had an ambulance coming and explained that we were going to need to get into Betty's place. Again, it was a bit awkward to explain who I was and why I was asking, but I mentioned that I could see her from her window and that I thought she'd passed away, and he said he would be there to help out the paramedics if they needed. Long story short, the paramedics got there, the maintenance tech showed up, and he let them into her unit because, from what he saw, it did look like she was deceased. Sure enough, the paramedics entered and confirmed what we'd thought. She'd fallen asleep in her chair and had passed away. I stuck around to answer their questions, but I didn't tell them that her spirit had come to my door or anything. I told them that I'd come over to see her and knocked on her door, and when she didn't answer, I looked in the window and saw her. Thankfully, that was enough to satiate them, as they could tell that there was no foul play involved. So, that's my story of the one rainy night, literally last month, where my neighbor's spirit decided to come over and let me know that she was gone, and asked me to help her out. I would have to guess that the reason was because she thought she wouldn't be found for a while. Like I said, it's a very quiet and rather reserved neighborhood. I'm glad that I could help her out after she'd gone, and hopefully she's able to rest peacefully. I used to work the night shift for a 24-hour convenience store in a fairly quiet suburban area. The job was typically uneventful, which is a welcome thing to a 20-year-old college student that needed the work-life balance that I did. I've always sucked at studying, and I'm horribly prone to stress, but since the job was pretty do-nothing most of the time, I was able to get some studying in while sitting behind the counter. The boss didn't really care, as long as the register closed out accurately and the store stayed relatively clean. There was one rainy night in the spring of 2020, though, that I thought something bad was going to happen. I will say that it did end up as one of those stories where nothing really happened, thankfully, but that was pure dumb luck. And if things hadn't gone the exact way they had, it would have been a terrible situation. It was one of those nights where it was coming down in buckets, and it was coming down for pretty much the entire night. It wasn't a violent storm, just one of those early spring storms where it's steady for hours on end. When it started to rain, I immediately knew that this was going to be the perfect night. I had a pretty major midterm coming up and I needed to study for it. And a heavy rain typically meant a dead store. Most people that would come through for their soda and candy in the middle of the night would just stay home, which meant that I had several hours to do absolutely nothing. We had a few brave souls come through, but it was so few that I think we made 3 transactions in just as many hours. A slow night, for sure. Around 2 in the morning, when the rain was starting to slow down a bit, a man entered the store. He was drenched from head to toe, water literally dripping off his coat onto the floor. I know this because I remember as he walked in, I went over to get the wet floor sign and the mop. While I was setting up the sign, he walked over to where I was standing and said, "Hey." It made me jump because I was struggling with the damn clamp on the sign that held it up, and I didn't realize that he'd gotten that close. I apologized for jumping like that and told him that I'd ring him up in a second and that the sign was a pain, just trying to make a slight joke to ease the tensions. When I glanced up at him, though, he didn't seem to get the humor. His eyes were wide and were darting, and he almost had this nervous energy about him. I tried to ignore it. Maybe he was on something, maybe he was just hopped up on caffeine. It was honestly none of my business. I finished what I was doing and walked back around the counter and looked at him, waiting for him to approach. But he just stood there staring at the sign that I had just put up, and then nervously glancing around the shop. I asked him if he was ready to check out, and he quickly turned his head toward me and stared without saying anything, then turned and walked back to the soda cooler for a second time. I just watched him like, okay, this guy is a bit weird. But again, we got weirdos pretty frequently. After a couple of moments, he walked up to the counter with a bottle of soda, a few candy bars, and a few other various snack items. I scanned the items and tried to make a bit of small talk, mentioning the storm and laughing that he forgot his umbrella. He responded in monosyllables, not even full words for half the conversation, and the whole time he would not look at me. His jumpiness was starting to make me a bit nervous, but again, I just had to accept that he was awkward and move on. As I handed him his change, he suddenly leaned in close enough that I could smell his breath, and whispered, "You shouldn't be here alone." His stare and words sent a chill down my spine, and I just sort of stammered and mumbled that I had a coworker out back, and that they would be back in momentarily. He didn't respond. He just stared at me for a long, uncomfortable few seconds, and then turned to leave. I breathed a sigh of relief when he left, thinking that the situation could have ended badly had he not believed me. A few hours passed, and by the time 4:30 rolled around, I had mostly forgotten about the whole interaction, shrugging it off as just a weird thing that happened. About that time, I was on the main floor sweeping up some of the aisles and making sure the store was tidy and organized so that I could spend my last couple of hours stalking and getting back to my studying before I went home, when I heard the door chime again. I looked up, thinking it was going to be one of our early morning regulars, but my heart sank when I saw that it was him again. This time, he didn't even pretend to shop. He walked straight to the end of the aisle that I was sweeping, standing between myself and the front counter, and looked me dead in the eyes. "You're still here? I told you it's not safe to be alone." His tone was almost accusatory, like he was angry at me for still working. I swear he was giving me this malicious smirk like he was about to commit something terrible. And of course, my main thought was that he was going to attack me and rob the store. I once again stammered out that my coworker was in the back, and that they would be out at any moment, hoping to possibly deter him. But I could very clearly see that it wasn't going to work a second time. He just laughed out a cold and hollow sound that made me feel sick. By some miracle or manifestation, as soon as he took a step forward, the door to the back swung open and the morning manager, Jim, stepped toward me, saying, "Hey, morning Morgan, how's the night been?" without looking up and seeing the situation that was unfolding. When Jim stepped out and the man saw him, he looked back at me and shook his head slightly, then quickly left the store, which did catch Jim's attention. He watched the guy walk out of the store, looked up at me, and I was pretty obviously distraught. He asked what that was all about, and I told him that I was pretty certain that that guy was about to rob the store before he walked in. At first, Jim thought I was joking, and he kind of chuckled, but he quickly realized I was being very serious. He asked if he should call the police, and if the guy had actually made any threats or anything. I told him that he was just being aggressive and that he had warned me, saying that I shouldn't be here alone. Which, when I said it sounded kind of weak and silly. Thankfully, Jim took it seriously. He said that he would get the guy's picture off of the security camera and would let the other managers know that this guy was trouble. He also said that he would talk to the general manager about getting a second person for the overnight shift, because he agreed that one person working the entire shift alone was a recipe for disaster. Thankfully, I never saw the man again, but the event definitely made me feel vulnerable on the overnight shift. The general manager did take Jim's advice, and within a week, we had a second person on the overnight, and every shift from then on had at least 2 people. I know that it cost them more in labor, but it was nice that they realized how serious this situation was. I'm grateful that he wasn't given the opportunity to follow through on his vague threats, but At the same time, I know how much it was dumb luck that saved me that night. If Jim had been running late at all, he would have had the chance to do what he was going to do. And I would have ended up injured or much, much worse. I have a story about a night a couple of years ago that was a pretty chilling experience. And not just because it was a cold and rainy night. It was the middle of September, which meant the temp was trying to get a little lower, but it was still the end of summer, so it wasn't anything more than light jacket weather. Due to some circumstances mostly out of my control, I no longer had a car, and was reliant on public transportation for pretty much everything, which was a pain because I worked from 10 to 9 at my job, and the bus here was very prompt. So I needed to get out of work on time and make a dash to the bus stop to get to the bus, or else I would have to wait quite a while for the next one. On this particular night, I actually got out of work at 9:10 p.m., and I knew right away that there was no way I was making the next bus, so I was walking slowly in the rain to the bus stop and feeling a bit ticked off at the world. I was moody back then. Cut me some slack, I was still pretty young. I sat there at the bus stop, messing with my phone and thinking about plugging in my earphones to listen to some music and pass the time, when I heard something that sounded like a slight groaning sound. At first I thought it was just the wind, or something like that with how faint it was, but then it happened a second time, and at that point I realized that it wasn't. My curiosity was piqued, because it was definitely some kind of groaning, and it was a bit weird to hear. I stepped off the sidewalk and over to the end of the street, where there were some trees and brush. Initially, I thought it was just some drunk guy that had passed out in the bushes, and I was kind of laughing to myself like, damn dude, you chose a bad night to get hammered and sleep outside. But as I got closer, the groaning got louder, and it sounded less like they were drunk, and more like they were in pain. I followed it to a pretty thick part of the brush, and was shocked by what I saw. It was a man, which I anticipated, but his clothes were soaked, and not just from the rain. There was a large red stain on his shirt that was coloring the dirt around him as well. Panic set in and I rushed over to him, asking if he could hear me. He was conscious, but barely, and his breathing was very labored. He was able to whisper out, "Oh God, please help." I told him that I would help him and to just hold on. I grabbed my phone and immediately dialed emergency services. I struggled to explain the situation beyond, there was a guy that was bleeding out on the ground, and where I was. She told me to stay on the line and asked me if I could do anything to apply pressure to the wound and to try and stop the bleeding. I was not prepared for this situation. I didn't know the first thing about first aid, and I was so worried that I was just going to make it worse. Thankfully, she talked me through what to do. I pulled off my jacket and informed him what I was going to do. I tensed up when he gasped as I pushed on the wound, but I told him that it was going to be okay. I explained that, based on how he was injured, it looked like he'd likely been stabbed, but that I didn't see a knife anywhere. He nodded at me and quietly whispered, "Stabbed," which confirmed what I saw. As we waited for help to arrive, the man's gaze met mine and I could see the fear in his eyes. He tried to speak, but I couldn't really hear him. I leaned closer and told him that he needed to go ahead and just stay calm, not speak, and that the ambulance was on the way, which the operator continued to assure me was the case. He was able to whisper out, "He ambushed me. Didn't see his face." I just nodded in confirmation and told him to hold on, that he would be okay. The whole thing was surreal. I had just gotten off work thinking I was going to be sitting and waiting for the bus for half an hour. Yet here I was, knelt down in the rain and holding a stranger's life in my hands. The sirens as they approached was the most welcoming sound I have ever heard. The paramedics arrived quickly, taking over within seconds, trading places with me and getting the man into the ambulance. One of the medics actually thanked me for calling them, as I may have saved this man's life, and that I did a damn good thing. Then the police arrived and started asking me questions about what I'd seen, what I'd heard. I told them what I could, but I couldn't offer a lot, as I had only heard him groaning and pretty much stumbled onto the situation. It was pretty clear that whoever had attacked him was long gone, and they had just left him for dead on the side of the road. They also told me that he was lucky that I had found him, that if it had been a few more moments, there was a good chance that he wouldn't have made it. After giving my statement and telling them everything a couple of times over, I was left at the bus stop to sit there and replay the entire event over in my mind. The bus did arrive, right on time, and I got home without issue. But that night was a rough one. I learned later on that he did survive the attack, but that the assailant was never caught. It's a terrifying thought that I've had multiple times over. The fact that, had I left work on time, there was a chance that that guy would have died there in the bushes. I don't know the exact time he was attacked, but I would have likely been running on the bus and gone on without even noticing he was there. It's the one night that I'm glad that I had to work a few minutes late, because that inconvenience may have been the saving grace that kept that man alive. Hey, okay. My boyfriend was driving and I was sitting in the passenger seat. It was nighttime and we were traveling across the state to stay at my parents' house for a while. Our rent got too expensive, and we needed somewhere else to stay so that we could save up to get our own place again. Not relevant to the story, but it provides some background. We were casually listening to the radio and chatting between ourselves when it started to rain. Okay, it wasn't too bad. Driving in the rain wasn't a big deal. We had our headlights on and we drove through the country road. Unfortunately, our trip slowed down when my boyfriend couldn't see anymore. We stopped at one of those 24-hour service stations that had warm food. We sat inside, ate, and other than the clerk, there were no other customers in there with us. Then a beat-up-looking truck drove into a parking spot. A scruffy and wet-looking man with dirty clothes came into the station, and we noticed the smell. A musty, foul, and almost fishy odor hung in the air. I thought maybe he was a fisherman, or just didn't have decent hygiene. We tried to be polite and did not look at him or anything. He walked around, looking at the items, and then came and looked at us. Whenever we would look at him, he would drop his gaze and then look elsewhere. I noticed him doing this a couple of times. I figured he was going to ask us for some change or something, so I ignored him. My boyfriend and I forgot that he was there during our conversation. Finally, we finished our food and the rain was beginning to ease off, so we went out and got in the car and left. After a bit, we noticed some headlights driving behind us. My boyfriend recognized that it was the same man from the service station. Since we were driving on the highway, we didn't think too much of it. He was probably just headed towards the same place that we were. It was only when we drove into his parents' suburb that beat-up-looking truck followed us. We pulled over by the side of the road and he did the same. He didn't get out of the car. He just sat there and stared at us with the headlights still on. My boyfriend was going to get out, but I grabbed his arm and told him not to. I didn't know if this guy had a gun or some other kind of weapon, and I didn't want him to get hurt. He stayed in the car with me, and after a while, we drove off. I wasn't surprised when I saw those same damn headlights following us in the rain. I really did not like this. We drove around for a while. We couldn't really speed up, and we didn't want to crash. It's hard to explain, but he just seemed to disappear. We saw the headlights, and then we didn't. I don't know if it was some kind of weird glitch that happened, whether he drove off or what exactly happened. It's honestly a mystery. Maybe people in the comments section can help me work out what happened there. So from there, we spent some time at his parents' place, and we had to go get some extra blankets and towels for the house. While we were out, we actually noticed a missing poster for that man. He looked cleaner, healthier, and the poster said that there were grave concerns for his health. We reported it to the police, but there were no leads. The posters for him are still up around town, and through the small town gossip, I heard that his truck was stolen and never seen again. I think it's one of those stories where there is some truth to it, but there were some other reports of him being seen, but that he was a ghost. I don't think that's the case. And it's in bad taste to say that he is a ghost, or make up some BS story about it. So I don't know if it was actually him or not. Maybe he was staring at us because he wanted help. I do feel bad if we were his last chance, but we equally did not want to get hurt either. It sucks how you have to be careful about who you help, because some people are crazy, or predatory. But you gotta do what you gotta do. I don't know if he was ever found, or if he remains a missing person. And as strange as it sounds, I don't think it would have been anywhere near as unsettling if it hadn't been raining. The thick rain made it difficult to see, and we had to go slower unless we wanted to get into a car accident. I'm not really sure how to end this, but I do want to say that you're one of the best in the narration game, Raven, and I hope that this story was good enough to narrate. It was, and thank you. So that, my friends, was a collection of some rainy night horror stories, a collection of stories that all take place on rainy nights. Nights where it's rainy can be terrifying. I'm a huge fan of the rain, though. I love those nights where it's just non-stop downpouring. You can hear the rain coming down, you can hear the thunder, the wind, that kind of stuff. It's very relaxing, in my opinion, at least. Maybe not to everybody. Probably not these people that had these situations happen. They may say that it's a little less than relaxing to have a rainy night, and if so, I understand. But how about you? What do you think of rainy nights? Have you ever experienced anything creepy on a rainy night? Well, if so, consider sending it my way. You can go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to submit the story, and you may very well see it on this channel. If you're on Reddit, you can also go to r/theravensdream and submit it there. Either way, I get to read it, potentially narrate it. You get to enjoy me narrating it if you so choose. If you liked these stories, you can also hit the thumbs up button on the video, as that helps tremendously. You can also subscribe if you liked what you heard and want more content like this, and content that's nothing like this. I do a huge variety of stories, I do. And if you are feeling bold, go down below the video, letting me know your thoughts. Did you like the video? Did you like the stories? Do you like the thumbnail? Do you like the rain? Do you like Cheerios? Do you like oatmeal? I love oatmeal. You can just leave me a comment down below with anything you feel comfortable leaving, and I'll try to respond. I know I haven't been the best at responding, and I do apologize for that. November has kind of been a crappy month for me. I'm trying to get back into the swing of things. I am sorry. But yeah. All that said, friends, I hope that you have a beautiful and lovely weekend. I hope that I do see you here again very, very soon. But until then, remember you are loved, you are valid, you are important. You're the best you that you can be. Do not forget it, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Until next time, much love, and sleep well.